Lonely cowboy bought young pregnant woman sold by her parents, then found the miracle he'd waited for. The prairie stretched wide, as if the world had cracked open just to let silence pour in. Dust swirled in slow dancing spirals, drawn up by a wind that whispered through bone-dry grass and fences forgotten by time. Out there, where the land wore loneliness like a second skin, a man rode alone. His name was Elias Ridge, though few ever said aloud. He wasn't the kind men called on for drink or dice. Folks spoke of him in quiet tones, the way one might speak of a grave that never got marked, respectfully, distantly. Some said he'd lost a brother to a fire. Others said a wife to fever. Truth was, no one knew for certain, but he carried something in his silence, something sorrow-shaped, and so the town kept its distance. He didn't seem to mind. He came into town once every fortnight, not for company, not for church, just supplies, feed, salt, soap, nothing more. When he passed through the street, even dogs kept their voices down. But that day, as his horse's hooves clapped against the hard earth, something different stirred the air. A wagon had rolled into the town square, faded green paint peeling like old regrets. It carried a preacher, round and sweating, and his wife, eyes like steel pins. They stood on the bed of the wagon, all holy talk and downcast faces. Between them sat a girl, young, belly heavy with child, hands clasped in her lap like she was trying to disappear into herself. The preacher raised his arms and cried words that didn't belong in that sun-baked place. He spoke of sin, of shame, of consequence. He said she had been cast out by her family, so like something already broken. He said someone righteous might take her in for the right price. The townsfolk gathered slowly, not out of curiosity, but caution. No one wanted to be seen staring too long. A few murmured. A few laughed low in their throats. Most simply turned away. The girl did not raise her eyes. Her dress, though clean, didn't fit right, swallowed her small frame. Her face, sunburnt and streaked with dust, held no expression at all. But her fingers dug into her knees, white-knuckled and fierce, like she was holding herself in place. Elias watched in the shadow of the general store, hands still on the reins. He hadn't planned to stop long, hadn't planned to look either, but something about the way she sat, so still, so small and yet unyielding, lodged in him like a splinter. The preacher called for bids. No one stepped forward. Time passed, slow and sour. The preacher grew red. His voice cracked. The woman beside him stared at the girl with something colder than hatred. Still silence. Then Elias moved. He walked without hurry, boots steady, hat pulled low. No fanfare, just a quiet crunch of step after step until he stood below the wagon. Looking up at the girl, he said nothing, just reached into his coat, pulled out a roll of thin rope and a rusted coin pouch. He placed both at the preacher's feet. A mule, a saddle, a rifle with a crack stock. The preacher looked like he might protest, but something in Elias's face halted him. The trade was accepted with more relief than honor. The girl didn't speak as Elias helped her down. She didn't look at him. He didn't touch her unless he had to, guiding her arm like it was made of glass. When her feet hit the ground, he offered her the second horse. She climbed into the saddle with the stiff grace of someone used to doing hard things alone. They left without a word. The ride was long. The wind picked up, dry and relentless, carrying grit that bit at their eyes. Elias didn't try to talk. He watched her from the side sometimes. Her chin lifted just enough to defy the world, but not the wind. She winced with every bump. The child weighed heavy inside her. His homestead came into view like a memory someone left behind. A small cabin worn soft by weather and time. A barn with its left side sagging like a drunk. A split-rail fence half swallowed by prairie grass. But it was clean, kept, lived in if not lived with. She dismounted slow, looked around like she might still wake from it all. Elias opened the door, gestured with his hand. She stepped inside. The cabin was simple. One room, 2 beds, a table with mismatched chairs, firewood stacked neat near the stove, a quilt on each bed, both hand-stitched. The air held a faint scent of cedar and something sweeter, maybe apples gone soft. He pointed to the bed nearest the window. "You'll sleep there," he said, his voice rough from disuse. She nodded. Still no words. He left bread and a tin of honey on the table, a pitcher of water, then stepped outside. That first evening passed like fog. She didn't eat much. He didn't ask why. She sat by the fire until her eyelids fell. He listened to the boards creak under her weight as she crawled into bed. He watched the moon rise from the porch, alone but not alone, not anymore. In the days that followed, things settled not with sound but with rhythm. Elias did what he'd always done. Fed the animals, fixed the fence, tended the earth. She began to sweep the porch, fold the linens, chop vegetables with quiet care. When she cooked, it was simple but warm. When he brought home eggs, she set one aside for baking. The space between them was not filled with talk, but with soft things. The scrape of spoons, the clink of firewood, the low hum of wind. One morning, he left a shawl on the end of her bed. No note, just wool and warmth. She wore that day and every day after. When she spoke, finally, it was like a stone thrown into a still pond. "My name's Clara." He nodded. "Elias." They left it at that. She didn't ask about the trade. He didn't ask about the baby's father. Some stories they both seemed to know didn't need telling. Weeks passed. The first frost came. She began to walk slower, sleep longer. Her hands found her belly often, unconsciously. He began building a bench for the porch, something for her to rest on. One evening, she sat on it, breath hitching slightly as she eased herself down. He was nearby, splitting kindling. She looked out across the fields, sky lit with fire-orange twilight. "Never thought quiet could feel like kindness," she said, barely more than a whisper. Elias paused mid-swing, the axe held loose in his hand. He didn't reply, but he turned his face toward her, and in the dying light, something in his eyes softened. That was the first time she smiled, just a little, and so the days rolled on, like slow water over smooth stone. There was no talk of what came next. No plans, no promises. Just two people breathing the same air. Healing, though neither would have called it that. Not yet, but in the quiet, in the hush of frost and firelight, something small and sacred took root, and though neither dared to name it, it felt like the beginning of a miracle, something worth staying for. Winter pressed itself over the prairie like a hush no one dare break. The land dull beneath frost, every breath turning silver in the air. Smoke curled steady from the chimney of Elias Ridge's cabin, a quiet signal that somewhere out there life still lingered, even if it barely spoke. Clara had begun to walk slower, one hand always anchored at her belly. She moved like a woman who'd grown used to carrying more than just a child inside her. Guilt, perhaps. Loneliness. The grief of being handed away like worn cloth. But she wore it with a quiet dignity, her back unbent even as the weight increased. Elias kept his rhythm, up before light, chores by instinct. He didn't speak much, but he left things in his wake. Stacked firewood beside the door, a sharpened knife set carefully on the cutting board, a worn book placed by her bedside. Not demands, not gestures meant to earn favor, just presence, steady and kind. They shared space, but not breath. At first, she would rise after he left the cabin, sweep the floor where his boots had marked it, warm what he'd left behind, biscuits on a covered plate, a folded note with the day's weather scratched in simple lines. She began to answer his silence with small acts of her own. Herbs hung drying from the rafters. The table was always wiped clean. A pot of stew waited at day's end. Some nights, when the wind whistled cruelly through the cracks in the wall, they would sit across from each other, each with a cup in hand. The silence didn't feel empty anymore, just full of things not yet ready to be spoken aloud. One morning, she found a bundle of yarn and needles beside the fire, the kind used for baby things. Her fingers trembled when she picked them up. She didn't ask if he'd placed them there. She simply began to knit. Outside, the world still beneath snow. Horses huffed in their stalls, their breath ghosting into the cold. Elias worked with methodical grace, shoveling paths, reinforcing the barn roof, mending what little needed mending. He watched the weather and the animals like a man who'd learned long ago that storms didn't always knock before they came. One afternoon, Clara ventured out to the porch. The cold bit at her skin, but the air was clean and alive. She eased herself down onto the bench Elias had built, her belly a mountain in front of her. "You ever been married?" she asked, voice soft, nearly shy. Elias, standing at the fence with a pail of feed, turned slightly. He took a moment before answering. "No." She nodded as if she'd expected that, as if it fit the quiet sadness stitched into his coat seams. "Me neither," she said. "Just thought I might be. Once." The wind tugged at her shawl. She didn't elaborate, and he didn't ask. But that evening, he brought a second log of fire and let it burn longer than usual. The cabin held a warmer silence that night. Days drifted like snowfall, slow, soundless, each one leaving its shape on the earth. The baby inside her shifted more now. Sometimes in the middle of the night, she'd wake with a cry lodged in her throat, hand pressed to her side. Elias would stir, wordless, rise from his bed, stoke the fire. He'd bring her tea, sit in the dark nearby, waiting until her breath came steady again. She told him one morning that the child had kicked strong, hard enough to feel from the outside. Elias didn't say anything, but the next time she mentioned it, he stepped closer, hesitant. She took his hand, weathered rough, not used to such things, and placed it gently on her belly. He stilled entirely. The baby shifted under his palm. Something in him seemed to fracture and rebuild in that moment. He didn't pull away quickly. When he did, his hands trembled just slightly before he folded them back into himself. That night, she sang quietly near the fire, not a full song, just a few lines from something her mother used to hum before the house turned cold with silence and judgment. Elias listened from the shadows. His eyes softened, though they never left the flames. The first time she saw him laugh, really laugh, was when she burned the biscuits. The smell brought him in from a barn. She stood at the stove, face covered in flour, smoke coiling around her. She cursed under her breath, then looked up and saw him leaning against the doorframe, trying not to smile. "That bad?" she asked, squinting at the tray. He nodded once, then took the worst of the lot and bit into it without flinching. She laughed, and he did too, low and rough, like a man unlearning silence. There was a moment after, quiet and still, where neither moved, and then the kettle screamed and the moment passed. The days began to lengthen, just barely. Snow started melting into the seams of the land. Clara began folding the small things she'd knit. Blankets, socks, a tiny cap the color of wheat. She placed them in a basket near her bed. It wasn't spoken aloud, but both of them had started preparing for what was coming. A birth, a shift, a reckoning. Then came Lottie. She arrived in a flurry of fabric and boots, her wagon creaking under the weight of her presence. A widow who ran the boarding house in town. Lottie was sharp-tongued, warm-hearted, and had no interest in Elias's gruffness or Clara's shyness. She barged into the cabin like she'd been invited. "Well," she said, taking in the place with a glance, "this home's got more quiet than a Sunday graveyard. Let's stir it up, shall we?" Clara blinked. Elias stood frozen with a ladle in hand. Over tea, Lottie told stories of her younger years, of stubborn men and fiercer women, of lost loves and found strength. She eyed Clara's belly with experienced wisdom and nodded approvingly at the neatness of the cabin. "You're doing just fine, girl," she said, squeezing her hand. "He's not much for talk, but he listens. That's more than half of him." Clara smiled, a real one, the kind that reached her eyes. Before leaving, Lottie pressed a bundle of linens into Clara's hands and whispered something only she heard. Elias watched in the doorway as Clara nodded, tears glistening in her eyes, though she didn't let them fall. After Lottie left, the cabin felt fuller somehow, like her spirit had left a crack in the wall where light now poured in. One night, as wind rattled the shutters and coyotes howled somewhere far, Elias placed something on Clara's lap, wrapped in burlap. She unfolded it gently. A wooden cradle, hand-carved, smooth-edged, simple, beautiful. She ran her fingers over the grain, said nothing for a long time. Then, with her voice barely a whisper, she said, "No one's ever made me something before." Elias didn't answer, but the way he looked at her, It was the answer. Later, she placed one of the tiny knitted socks inside the cradle, like a promise to come. And in the silence that followed, something changed. Not loud, not sudden, just sure. He had not bought her. She had not begged him. But there they were, two people once tossed aside by the world, learning to build something it had never taught them to want. A home not made of wood or stone, but of quiet gestures, shared stillness, and a long quiet that somehow began to feel like peace. The snow would melt soon. The baby would come. But in that moment, in the hush of firelight and shadows, Clara reached out and placed her hand gently over Elias's. He didn't pull away, and neither of them spoke, because sometimes the heart doesn't need words to know it's been heard. The thaw came slow, as if winter itself were reluctant to leave. Snow turned to slush, mud clung to boots, and the sky stayed low with a tired sort of gray. Clara moved with more weight now, the child inside her pressing downward with every step. Her breath came harder, and Elias adjusted without asking, chopping with twice as often, saddling her horse when she could no longer reach the stirrup, placing a stool beneath her seat at the table. He still didn't say much, but Clara had learned to read him. The small tilt of his head when he listened, the way his hands twitched when she winced, the way he always left a lamp burning, even if she was just outside gathering eggs. It was care without obligation, and it softened something in her that had gone stiff with fear a long time ago. She had begun to hum more, a thread of music slipping into the walls, as if to make the cabin feel less temporary. Elias started coming in earlier from his work, sometimes carrying trinkets, wildflowers in a jar, a feather, a stone polished by the creek. She didn't ask if they were for her. He didn't say, but she kept them all. It might have gone on like that, quiet, safe, growing in small, sacred ways, until the rider came. She saw him first through the window, midday sun catching the dust behind his horse, broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, dressed better than most who came through these parts. Something about the way he sat the saddle made Clara's stomach twist, not from fear exactly, but from memory. Her hand dropped to her belly. She opened the door before he reached it. Elias stood up from the porch rail, slow, like someone already bracing for a storm. The man dismounted with practiced ease, rein slack in his hand. He took off his hat, revealing a slick grin beneath polished hair. "Clara," he said, voice smooth and easy as a lie. "Been looking all over for you." She didn't answer. "Guess I should have known you'd find someone dumb enough to take you in." Elias didn't speak, didn't move, but the air around him shifted, like something rising beneath still water. The man turned to him with a casual glance. "You must be the hero. Hope you kept the receipt." Clara stepped between them. "What do you want, Jude?" Her voice cracked slightly, but her spine stayed straight. He gestured at her belly. "My child. That's mine, isn't it?" She blinked, stunned by the audacity of him saying it aloud, like it meant something, like he'd earned the right to speak it. "You left," she said, each word sharp and quiet. "You knew, and you left." "Didn't know you'd go and sell yourself," he snapped, eyes flashing. "Didn't know you'd end up playing house with some mute cowboy." Elias's jaw twitched. Still, he said nothing. Jude stepped closer, his voice dropping low. "I've got claims. Legal ones. Blood matters, even out here." "You've got nothing but a name I'm not using," Clara replied. "Go back to wherever you were pretending to be a man." He looked her over, something ugly simmering behind his smile. "I'll be back," he said, "with someone who makes your choices matter." He turned, mounted, and rode off with more speed than needed, leaving dust that didn't settle for minutes. Elias watched until the figure disappeared. Then he looked at her, not with judgment, not with fear, just a quiet question, unspoken. She didn't cry, though she wanted to. She turned and walked inside. That night, the cabin felt smaller, colder, though the fire burned strong. Elias sharpened his knives at the table, not aggressively, just routine. Clara folded and unfolded the same blanket 3 times. "You don't have to keep me," she said suddenly. He didn't look up. "I know what this looks like. A man takes in a girl, ends up with another man's baby on his porch. I wouldn't blame you if—" He set the blade down, slowly. looked her in the eyes. "You're not a burden," he said. "You're not a mistake. You're not leaving." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It held her like arms might have, had he known what to do with them. Still, worry coiled in her chest. Jude would return, and not alone. She lay awake that night, one hand on her stomach, the other curled beneath her chin. Elias sat by the fire long after she'd gone to bed. His face, bathed in flickering light, looked like someone remembering how to pray. 3 days passed, then 4. Clara stayed close. Lottie visited once, bringing biscuits and a look in her eye like she'd heard the whispers already rising through town. She kissed Clara's forehead, gripped Elias's arm harder than expected, and said nothing about the shadow hanging over them. Then, on the 5th night, her water broke. It happened sudden, a sharp intake of breath, a pool spreading across the floor. Elias rushed to her side, fumbling for blankets, for the water pot, for anything. His calm cracked, but his hands didn't shake. Clara gripped the edge of the bed, teeth clenched. "You need to go for help," she said through the pain. He looked at the door, then at her. His eyes burned. "I'm not leaving you." She cried out again, sweat beading on her brow. He moved closer, wiping her face with trembling fingers. Miss Lottie arrived just before the second scream, as if summoned by the storm. She came in with her sleeves rolled and orders flying. Boil water. Keep her upright. And for God's sake, don't stand there like a tree. Be the man she's already counting on. The labor dragged long. Hours folded into hours. Clara screamed once, then went quiet. Too quiet. Elias knelt beside her, whispering things he didn't even know he believed. "You're not alone. You're not alone." Miss Lottie worked fiercely, hands firm but gentle. "She's strong," she kept saying. "She's at the kind of fire men don't know how to carry." Then at dawn, just as the sky cracked pink and gold across the hills, a cry rose that didn't belong to Clara. A girl. Lottie placed the child against Clara's chest. Clara looked at her, breath ragged, and then toward Elias. "She's here," Clara whispered, voice gone to dust. Elias stood frozen. Then, slowly, he stepped forward. He looked down at the child, wrinkled red, wailing with all the fury of birth, and something in his face collapsed. He reached out, unsure, then pulled back. Clara took his hand, placed it gently on the baby's back. "She's yours," she said, "not by blood, but by every quiet thing you've ever done for me." He didn't speak, just nodded once, as if trying to hold together all the pieces of himself. The child quieted. They sat like that, the 3 of them, wrapped in firelight and mourning, and for a moment, nothing outside mattered. Not Jude, not law, not the past. Just the sound of a new heart learning to beat. But in the distance, hooves echoed. Not many, just enough to break the stillness. Elias rose, slow and sure, and reached for his coat. Clara held the child tighter. "Whatever comes," she said, "don't let them take her." He looked at her then, full in the face. His eyes, glassy and grave, held no fear. "They won't." The sun rose slow that morning, spilling gold across the frostbitten grass, like spilled honey. Smoke curled steady from the chimney, thinner than usual, as if even the house held its breath. Inside, the warmth clung to life like a child to its mother, and on the bed near the window, Clara lay still, the baby sleeping against her chest. Elias stood at the doorway, one hand resting against the frame. His boots were on, coat buttoned high, hat low over his eyes. He had the quiet look of a man already walking towards something he didn't want to meet. Outside, hoofs drummed again, this time slower, measured, like men who came knowing they'd be watched. A sheriff rode in first, older, lean, dust-streaked. Behind him trailed Jude, smug as ever, dressed in finer clothes than the town had seen in years. 2 others followed, townsmen turned temporary witnesses, their eyes sharp with discomfort. Clara stirred in the bed, eyes fluttering open. She reached instinctively for the baby. Her hand trembled only once before settling. Elias stepped outside. The men dismounted, brushing off their coats like they were brushing off guilt. Sheriff Russ spoke first, voice level. "Mornin', Elias." Got word from the father of the child. Claims he's got rightful stake. Elias nodded once. She's inside. Just gave birth. Jude smiled like a man sure of the ending. She belongs with me, he said, trying to lace the words with care. The baby's mine. She needs her father. You mean now she does? Elias replied, his voice low, after months of silence. None of that's your concern, Jude snapped, stepping forward. You're not blood. You're not even kin. Behind him, the sheriff raised a hand. Let's hear her say it. No decisions get made without her will in it. Elias turned back toward the door and stepped aside. Clara stood there, thin and pale and wrapped in a shawl too light for the cold. The child rested in the crook of her arm, pink-cheeked and blinking against the light. Clara looked smaller than usual, but there was something in her eyes now that hadn't been there before. Not fear, not shame, but steel. The men tipped their hats awkwardly. Jude smiled again, that same practice grin. Clara, you're tired. I know this ain't how you pictured things, but I'm here now. I can give her a name. A real one. You and I, we can set things right. Clara stepped forward until she was level with Elias. The baby stirred and settled again. I already gave her a name, she said. Jude blinked. She's called Hope. The sheriff glanced toward Elias, then back at Clara. He claims a child. Legally, he's a father. That gives him voice in this. Clara nodded slowly. And what gives me voice? A long silence. I'm not a thing to be passed from one man to another. I was sold once. Not again. You want to know who held my hand through every pain? Who stood by me when I screamed through the dark? He's standing beside me now. That baby's never known a world without him in it. Jude stepped forward again. This ain't about you, Clara. It's about the child. She deserves someone who stayed. She cut in, voice sharp now. Not someone who shows up when it's easy. Jude looked toward the sheriff. I've got papers. I can file a claim. Sheriff Rusk sighed, looked around at the frost-gilded land, then at the woman standing there like a wind-worn statue with her child. She says she wants him, the sheriff said quietly. That's what I heard. Jude scoffed, backing away. This ain't over. Clara didn't flinch. Elias didn't move. Jude mounted his horse with more noise and grace, then rode out the way he came, alone again. The other men followed. Rusk lingered a moment, watching Clara with an unreadable expression. You're strong, he said at last. And lucky, he looked at Elias. Don't waste what you got. Then he was gone. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was clean, pure, the kind of silence that comes after a storm when the world holds still just to breathe. Clara let out a long breath. Her body sagged. Elias stepped forward and caught her, steadying her gently as they walked back inside. She lay down with the child curled close, eyes drifting shut. Elias sat nearby, elbows on his knees, watching him with something in his face that looked like awe. When she opened her eyes again, the light had shifted. Afternoon. Dust motes drifted through the air like slow, golden snow. I meant it, she said softly. He looked up. You're her father. Elias blinked once, said nothing. She reached for his hand, pulled it toward the cradle, where Hope now slept bundled in woolen dreams. She'll never know what it is to be unwanted. Because of you. He swallowed, jaw working quietly. I ain't much, Clara. I'm just a man who knows how to stay. She smiled. Sometimes that's the hardest thing of all. He looked at her long and slow, and for the first time, something like a smile ghosted across his mouth. Not broad, not practiced, just enough to feel like sunrise. Outside, the sky turned to blue so soft it made the earth look gentle again. Seasons passed. Hope grew, all curls and bright laughter. She chased chickens across the yard and rode atop her father's shoulders, giggling as the wind caught her tiny boots. Clara tended a small garden, her hands deep in soil and peace. And Elias, he built a new fence with his daughter at his heels, each post firm as the promises he never spoke but always kept. One day, another cradle was built, this one with smoother curves and finer polish. Clara's belly rounded again, the way spring swells beneath thaw. They didn't need to speak of love. It lived in their silences, in shared looks, in the way he brushed her hair back when she slept and the way she laced her fingers through his when words ran dry. Sometimes, as the wind swept low across the field, Clara would step onto the porch and watch her little girl run through grass taller than her knees. She'd rest her hand on her belly and smile. Then she'd look back at the man shaping what near the barn, a man who once bought a stranger with a saddle and a mule, but who never asked anything in return but the chance to stay. She would say to herself, "This is what a miracle looks like, not thunder or fire or revelation, just dust and kindness and the wind whispering through old trees, you are no longer alone." And out there, beneath the broad, unending sky, a lonely cowboy finally found the one thing he never knew he was waiting for, a family, and a place where his silence could finally rest. If this tale stirred something quiet in your heart, saddle up and subscribe for more stories under the wide western sky. And don't forget to ring that bell so you never miss when the next one rides in.